Hey, brothers and sisters of labor, how are you doing? Fired up is what we gotta be, because we got some work to do. And I don't want anybody to be discouraged about the political environment we're in, because we are actually in a very important and precious moment. The men and women of Ohio, some in unions, some not, came together and said, we demand the right to collectively bargain. The men and women of Wisconsin are getting ready to throw that bum out because he has attacked the right to fairness in the workplace. And I just want you to know that there's every reason to be encouraged right now. The only question is whether we are willing to commit ourselves to the task, because people are open to it, they're ready for it, and they want to hear it. And they know that it ought to be the case that you should just be able to sign a card, and if a majority of the workers on the line want the union, there should be one. And it ought to be the case that if a majority of those workers want that union, that labor should not be, management should not be able to just stall on a contract, and they ought to have some deadlines as to when they have to do something. It ought to be the case that workers who just want decent safety on the job shouldn't have to worry about politicians who are preoccupied with job-killing regulations. And it ought to be the case that men and women who work hard every day have enough money to put food on the table, and ought to have enough money to go to the doctor, and ought to have enough money to put the kids through school if they want to study and go. And it ought to be the case that once you have busted your tail for so many years, you ought to be able to retire with some dignity. But it is not the case in America today. And we have to make it so. And we have every reason to believe that we can be successful. And one of the roadblocks we have got to knock down has got to be this nasty Citizens United thing. I'm telling you, yes, we need a Disclose Act. I'm all for it. But we need a constitutional amendment that says corporations are not people, and money is not speech, and democracy is not for sale. Just a simple constitutional amendment which states the obvious, that an institution that has no purpose whatsoever than to acquire money and more and more and more is not a person. That an institution that is designed simply to reward its shareholders is not a person. That it can live forever. It has no body to incarcerate and no soul to save. It's not a person. It's so obvious, but we need our Constitution to reflect that obviousness, and it's going to take the work of all of us to do it. And I just want you to know that I'm the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, and we have dedicated ourselves to helping move this constitutional amendment forward. We're working with members of the Senate. It was so good to see the senator here. Senator Tom Udall is working with us, and we are pushing this agenda forward. And what we want to do, we're reaching out to state legislatures and asking them to introduce anti-Citizens United legislation, even if it's just a resolution, say down with it, and city councils and county boards and maybe even union boards and even Cub Scout troops, anybody we can get to say this thing sucks and we're going to get rid of it. And this is what we got to do. We got to build the national will to get rid of it, and we got to make people understand it. And they can understand it. They can easily understand it, that money has a corrupting influence on politics, and we got to get it out. We can certainly do this. And there's another thing we got to fight against, Mr. President, and that is 38 states are trying to deprive otherwise eligible citizens of their right to vote. And this is why And this is why I introduced two bills. One that said you don't have to have a government-issued photographic ID to vote in a federal election if you're otherwise qualified to vote. And I see no reason why anyone should have to have such a thing. Do you know that there's a lady named Dorothy Cooper? Anybody ever heard of Dorothy Cooper from Tennessee? This lady, before segregation, she could not vote in any election because of Jim Crow. But after we defeated Jim Crow, and you better believe the civil rights movement and the labor movement joined hands and brought down Jim Crow segregation. Tore it down. And we'll never go back there. And I just want to point out that when the great Martin Luther King lost his life, he was joining workers. Right. And here's the good news from that awful tragedy. That assassination didn't stop the strike. In fact, those workers won the strike. But Dorothy Cooper, she voted in every election once she could vote. Everyone never missed it. And one day she showed up for the election so she could vote, 90 years old. She had a police department issued ID with her picture on it. But you know what? The state legislature defined voting qualifications with this ID so narrowly that that ID wasn't good enough and she was denied the right to vote. Or how about the 11 nuns in Indiana showed up to vote? Sister Mary Margaret, you here to vote? Yes, dear, like I do every year. Well, Sister Mary Margaret, you got your government-issued photographic identification with the matching address? No, dear, I'm 90. I don't drive. I can't hardly see. They said, well, dear, you cannot vote. What? Yeah, sorry. And what about down in Texas where if you have a gun ID, you can vote with that, but if you have a student ID, you can't. I'm telling you, this has nothing to do with voter fraud, nothing to do with voter fraud, and everything to do with trying to exclude Americans from choosing who their leaders will be. That's what it's all about. And so we've got to fight this evil, this group ALEC, the American Legislative Change Council, the same people trying to pass anti-union, anti-collective bargaining, so-called right to work, which is a dastardly misnomer, right? These are the same people trying to exclude other folks from the vote. So we got to stand up against these people, and we got to make the case be clear. And we've got to let them know that, yes, workers and labor and people who labor and make our society run, the everyday heroes, you all, are going to be casting our ballots. And yes, students are going to vote. And yes, communities of color are going to vote. And yes, our seniors are going to vote. And yes, we're going to fight for our Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We're going to fight for the right to have an affordable education. We're going to fight to be able to bargain collectively, and we're going to fight for clean air, clean water. And you know what? This is the sacred struggle we have to dedicate ourselves to. And I want to let you know that I will be there. The Progressive Caucus will be there. The Dem Caucus will be there. And maybe even some Republicans who find a heart will be there. But there's no doubt that no matter who's there, you'll be there. And we'll be right there with you. God bless you guys.